Okay, everyone. So, hello to welcome to the second session of the Nāgārjuna Mula Madhyamaka Karika reading group. And we are starting today with an analysis of conditions, the first chapter. So before we go ahead and start, I'd like us all to take a moment of contemplative silence just to sort of get situated within ourselves and sort of remind ourselves a little bit about why we're here and what we're interested in and our underlying motivations for undertaking this reading and this study group. All right. So actually, just because I'm kind of curious, and this is our first sort of real study session, could people just give a short few sentences about what their experience was with reading this chapter? And if you've read it for the first time, or if it's your second or third reading or whatever, just interested in how people experience reading this. You can just unmute yourself and talk, or you can raise your hand and or something. Mark?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I think this chapter, I sort of understood what each verse means, but I don't really get the implications of it.
Oh. Anyone else have any comments about their experience reading this?
So this is my first time reading this chapter, but I was familiar with one of the arguments in this chapter. That is what Sideritz and Katsura called the application, in this case, causation of the argument from 3 times, which is also this argument, applying the argument for the 3 times to causation is sometimes called the refutation of the production from existent or non-existent. It's one of the 5. That's why I do it. It's one of the 5 famous arguments of the middle way.
Right. The diamond splinters.
Yeah, right after the diamond slivers diamond slivers is the analysis of the 4 ways that a thing can be causally produced, and then
okay.
The refutation from production of existent or non-existent, which is about the temporal relationship between the condition and the
okay.
And I had known about this argument, and it was interesting reading it in Nāgārjuna's own words, because this argument, I think, was actually the first time I read a Madhyamika argument, when I understood this argument, and I realized, oh wow, this actually has pretty far-reaching implications. So it was very interesting to read how Sideritz and Katsura touched on it.
Yeah, I also noticed something similar in the sense of there are a lot of these sort of I guess you could say like these different instruments of reasoning that can be applied to a variety of different concerns and topics. Even though we might be engaging with a particular concern in a particular verse, a lot of these sort of arguments sort of show up in multiple instances in the same way. So I like how these little tools that you can apply to a lot of different contexts. Anyone else? Or we can just get straight to the text.
It felt to me, like, full transparency, like a little bit frustrating. And I think that I got this vibe that like maybe it's supposed to be kind of, it's just like breaking down causal reasoning, even its own causal reasoning, it's just, yeah, I think maybe that's the point. That's the impression I'm getting right now.
Yeah, I could totally vibe with that. There's definitely an element. I wouldn't say wholeheartedly, but definitely there's an element to which Nāgārjuna is trying to frustrate a lot of these sort of deep underlying assumptions about how we understand really basic stuff like causality. And one general point I do want to make is that another translation and commentary, the Garfield edition, which I actually have here, that actually goes pretty much from the very beginning, already gives you a little bit of a sort of general framework to understand some of these verses, which is distinguishing between conventional and ultimate utterances. And it's a sort of way to qualify certain verses that might not be very apparent about whether or not they're making a statement from the conventional side of things or the ultimate side of things. And that's one way Garfield, and I think he borrows this from the Galuk tradition. This is one way that this tradition sort of tries to make sense of what Nāgārjuna is saying. When he's saying that, let's say, this and this cannot exist in this way, at face value, he sounds like he's denying existence as such of something. The Galuk approach might be to qualify that by saying that he's actually saying that from the ultimate standpoint, but still allows us to speak about existence on the conventional level. There's a value to that definitely in terms of intellectual comprehension of what we're reading, but I'm actually starting to appreciate this much more basic, unqualified way of understanding the text, at least at first, because I think that hits you to your core more in terms of really unsettling that sort of I guess, underlying assumptions you might have about how causation works. If you allow for this qualifying method, if you work with this qualifying method about, dividing statements between conventional and ultimate, it might be, how would you say, too easy in the sense that it allows your conceptual, intellectual mind to be able to make sense of the verses without letting it sort of hit you at the core about your actual psychological assumptions about how things work. So I like the sense of just taking the verses more at face value and allowing that sort of frustration to come up. Anyone else?
I guess I was thinking about when he elaborates on the four kinds of conditions. I was thinking about whether or not these four kinds of conditions are exhaustive and in which way they're exhaustive and how they relate to each other. It wasn't entirely clear. And I guess another thing is when he talks about causation being both from itself and from something distinct from itself. I wonder if it is true that it inherits the faults of, say, the first option. This isn't as clear to me as Nāgārjuna makes it in this first chapter. I guess if we understand these to be existing with intrinsic nature, then I guess he would argue that if something needs to be fully from itself and from something else, and it can't be qualified in this way where it takes part of something from something else and part of something from itself. But to me, this is, I think, this is a feasible way of understanding codependent origination that I think Nāgārjuna weirdly dismisses and says that it inherits the fault of the first. Yeah, I guess I just wanted people's thoughts on that.
You're referring, Jen, to the third limb, right? The sort of both and.
Yeah, that's right. And I see in some cases where it is obvious that it inherits the fault of the first or the second, but in this case, I guess if we understand these four options to be presupposed by kind of assumptions of Svabhava, then I could see it, but I don't know. I guess this needs more parsing out for me and be interesting to discuss. Because intuitively, I think this is how I understand causation. But anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. Relate to this. Definitely, a lot of times when I see refutations of the third limb of a tetralemma that's being presented, you might have a lot of reasoning for the first, second, and fourth, and the third one is always, well, since the first and second don't work, the third doesn't work. And that can be a little frustrating because you might want a little bit more elaboration. Because I would also agree that it does seem like a plausible way to understand causality or just existence. So yeah, hopefully we can sort of work through that when we get to that point. Okay, last call. Does anyone else want to say anything before we start? Okay, so let's start. So the first verse, not from itself, not from another, not from both, nor without cause, never in any way is there any existing thing that has arisen. I guess one comment I can immediately make that, Siddharth and Katsura already sort of make is that this sort of basically sets up the mood for the whole text. In a way, it's a lot, it's almost like it's like sort of the essential conclusion you might get from the whole book, just sort of condensed in this very first verse. And it introduces, a really important tool that Nāgārjuna and Madhyamakas in general employ, which is this tetralemma, these four coordinates, I guess you can say, four logical coordinates that we can plot any kind of expression, whether it's in the affirmative, whether it's in the negative, whether it's a combination of both, or if it's something completely different. And Nāgārjuna will argue in this chapter and throughout the text that existence cannot be grounded or found in any of these four modes. And these four modes are supposed to be completely logically exhaustive, so you can't really think outside of them. Does anyone have any comments on that? This first verse?
I think we can move to 2AB.
Sure.
With the first.
Yeah, so 2, the intrinsic nature of existence does not exist in the conditions, etc. The intrinsic nature not occurring, neither is extrinsic nature found. So yeah, let's start with that first part of the second verse. Did you have any comments on that, Sagar?
Well, I guess I just wonder. So I think it's clear what the argument is that things don't already, by their intrinsic nature, does not already exist in their conditions, or they simply would be their conditions. But I wonder, as far as I know, in a lot of the, I guess, traditions that accept Satkaryavada, what's thought to be occurring, or the sense in which the effect already exists in the cause, is that the effect is some kind of unactualized potential in the cause, which then is getting actualized. And so, for example, in, say, like, monist Shaivism, which accepts Satkaryavada, the, like, single ultimately real stuff, because they're monists, is taken to just be being itself, but to have, as part of being itself, the potential for actualizing anything. And so it's not actually changing in the process of things appearing, and the diversity of things is supposed to be an illusion. And I wonder if this I don't know if this argument really then works, I guess, against that kind of Satkaryavada, because in that case, that the person who believes in that kind of Satkaryavada can just bite the bullet. They can say, yes, the intrinsic nature of the effect does exist in the conditions, and the only reason why you can't see that is because of your, delusion and positioning, I guess, that is not seeing the bigger picture, which is that the intrinsic natures of all these things exist in the single existent. And it reminds me of, like, in Spinoza, how he talks about there just being one thing which exists in different modes. And that's why it seems like there are many things, but really it's one thing in different existential modes. And I wonder if that is a kind of Satkaryavada that's resistant to this argument Nāgārjuna is making, and how a Madhyamika might respond to that kind of Satkaryavada.
So if he was responding to some kind of monism, like a Shaivite monism, like you said, would a Madhyamaka still be able to say that intrinsic and extrinsic nature are still notional in a sense, like to even be able to distinguish between modes of the same substance, you still need like a kind of notional, because they're really, ultimately they're completely undifferentiated. So you would need to impart some kind of notional distinction between those two.
I see. I think that oddly enough, that might actually be something then that the monist might be in agreement with. Like the monist might say that they believe in Satkaryavada, that things are, that the effect exists in the cause. But their kind of Satkaryavada almost actually just seems like another way of saying that nothing actually arises, which is what Nāgārjuna is saying.
I think it really depends on what level of analysis we're talking about, like the level of analysis of modes or substance, to use like Spinoza's language, since you mentioned him. And, on the level of modes, maybe there is a lot of change, but on the level of substance, it's all like undifferentiated and there is no change. But like, I think, this might go somewhat well with the ultimate conventional distinction or something. But
well, one thing that I sort of like about this argument is that the saying that the effect already exists in the cause sort of is not parsimonious, in the sense that there's a sort of excessiveness that's there. So what I mean is, if an effect is in the cause, then what's the point of the effect in the first place? And so there's something superfluous about the effect, and this is not necessarily saying that the effect exists and it is superfluous, but that because the effect would be superfluous, it doesn't explain what the person is trying to explain, which is causation, which is an effect coming out of a cause that still inheres in a cause. So yeah, it's like it's adding more than there necessarily needs to be, and I think that probably relates to the fact that it's trying to make up for a logical fault. So I guess that's how I would sort of approach it, is that it makes effects superfluous when you say that an effect already exists in the cause. And so even though like we're going by verse and like part of a verse by verse, we can also always just go back and forth between verses too, to the extent that things, arguments link up, and sort of different verses might help us understand different things. So I don't want it to be too strict, just to let you know.
So just in response to, isn't the commentation, the comment on this responding to this idea that if the effect were superfluous, then arising would be pointless? So it says, this is simply not the case. Indeed, as commentators point out, if this were the case, then arising would be pointless.
Yeah, I think
is that like a counter argument to the concept that the effect is superfluous?
No, I think it's the same. Yeah, it's the same point I think I'm trying to make as the commentary, that yeah, it's the effect would be superfluous if it was already in the cause. So, and how are we talking about causality then?
it seems like this is, I mean, a couple things that just come to my mind are like nonlinear causality. It has to do with this, I think, somewhat. And then also like a block universe. And it's just kind of like on the table, like as far as like part of the cosmology in the background, like whether or not that, you know, the concept of a block universe makes sense. In what sense, you know, if everything of all time exists like right now, if that's, you know, I feel like that's a very related concept, but you know, I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard a little bit in the beginning to sort of deal with these, you know, almost like refutations of existence itself, and with a lot of our conventional ideas about like how the world works. So, and I think one thing I guess I want to emphasize is that there is an extent to which Nāgārjuna is denying causality, you know, conditionality, existence, etc., on this ultimate level in which things. Sorry, I just lost my thought. So just going back to that ultimate conventional distinction, there are different ways in which we can talk about causality in a conventional sense that we can't talk about in an ultimate sense. And I think a lot of these negations and refutations are from the ultimate side. So.
Sorry, I guess it seems like in the comments it's saying that like the cause is not, or the effect is not actually superfluous, because then in order to feel heat, we would only need to touch unignited fuel. Isn't that a refutation of that idea? For then, in order, if the effect were superfluous, then in order to feel heat, we would only need to touch unignited fuel.
If I'm understanding your point, I think when I was saying that an effect would be superfluous if an effect exists in the cause, is not to say that there is an effect and that it happens to be superfluous, but that the idea that an effect exists in a cause makes the concept of an effect superfluous, like logically speaking. So there's no reason to posit an effect in the first place. So it's more like, it's like begging the question as to like, why is there an effect at all if the effect is already in the cause? Because if the effect was already in the cause, then fire would be there just if there were fuel, without there being that cause from fuel to fire happening.
Yeah, one thing to note here that I found was helpful was that Nāgārjuna here is attacking the very presuppositions that underlie cause and effect. So he's not really working with like commonsensical cause and effect and then reducing them to absurdity, but rather like what are their philosophical presuppositions? How do we make sense of them? And then kind of reducing them to absurdity to show that actually our presuppositions are faulty. We don't need to posit a cause and effect in the first place. Or if we do, it's clear that they only function for us conventionally. They're not imbued with intrinsic nature.
Really reminds me of if anybody's ever read the article or essay by John Dewey, where he's also criticizing like billiard ball causality, and he posits like the sensory motor circuit. And the famous quote, I think, from that I thought was related to this text here is, he says, the burn, talking about seeing a candle, touching the candle and pulling away because of the heat of the candle. He says that the burn is the original seeing. The burn is in the seeing, which is not separated from the sensory motor action of pulling away from the heat.
That's interesting. Another interesting exercise you can do sometimes is to think about different kinds of like modern or even in contemporary thought and see how they sort of fit into one of these logical modes. It's an interesting exercise. So let's go to the next part of the verse. The intrinsic nature not occurring, neither is extrinsic nature found. And I think that sort of naturally follows from the first one. you know, if, let's see. Actually, does anyone else want to make a point first? Well, I'll make my point real quick. So extrinsic nature here, I guess, is para bhava. So intrinsic nature is fa bhava. And so if extrinsic nature is kind of like, could be a general like Buddhistic perspective, actually. So you might say that, well, if there's no intrinsic nature to things, there's an extrinsic nature. And it's through this relationship of extrinsic nature that things are dependently originated from each other. So it sounds like a Buddhistic view. But, you know, Nāgārjuna is not just refuting the views of non-Buddhists, but also certain kinds of Buddhists too. So if there's no svabhava, there can't be any parabhava, because if two or more sets of things which are in relation are not identical to themselves, you know, if they have no intrinsic nature of their own, then there's no way you can actually distinguish them from each other. And if you can't distinguish things from each other, then you can't really posit an extrinsic nature. You know, you have to actually be able to distinguish things in order to say that they have extrinsic natures. But if there's no basis to actually distinguish things from each other because they lack an intrinsic nature of their own, then there's no way to ground an extrinsic nature.
So one question I have about this is, does this argument show that I guess I'm not, Actually, I'll come back to my question when I take a little bit of time to think about what I want to ask.
Does anyone else have any comment on this second verse? Because I think we should move a little quick. I know this is dense, but I think going through the verses quicker might help us get a sense of the whole chapter, and that might help us then understand each particular verse too. Because, you know, I think all the verses sort of help each other in that way. And if you have a comment of any previous verse, you know, we can definitely go back, even if we're working on another one. So I guess we can also start on the third verse. So according to the opponent, there are 4 conditions: the primary cause, the objective support, the proximate condition, and of course the dominant condition. There is no 5th condition. And just because it might be helpful, I actually looked at the Garfield translation, and he translates things a little differently. So for primary cause, Garfield translates as efficient condition. For objective support, it's the percept object condition. For the proximate condition, it's the immediate condition. And they both translate dominant condition. So the way I sort of took notes from just deriving from the commentary is that a primary cause is that from which an effect has been produced. An objective support refers mostly to or entirely to cognition. So it's the intentional object of a cognition, like color, sound, or taste. That's the objective support. A proximate condition is what immediately precedes and cedes to an effect. And the dominant condition is that without which the effect could not arise at all. So I guess there's not much to discuss in this verse. It's just sort of setting out the various levels of different kinds of conditionality that Nāgārjuna will sort through in the following verses. Does anyone have any comment on that before we go to the 4th verse?
So this was the verse I think I found the most puzzling of this chapter, and for me, it's this seems to be this conflation between the metaphysics of causality and the conceptualization or the cognition of causality, which I think the second, the objective support, or the sort of intentional object. I'm forgetting how Garfield translated it, as you just said, but
Percept object condition.
Percept object condition. And this one seems to be targeted more towards it seems to be a criticism of how we conceptualize causality, and the others seem to be a criticism of how causality actually functions in the world. And I wonder if this first is a conflation, and if it is, whether it's intentional, because I understand that Madhyamaka wants to say that causality and how it actually is in the world is inextricably linked with how we conceptualize it. I think that's part of what they want to say, but I don't know. Did anyone have like the same kind of worry here of how it seems to be like not really exhaustive, but rather kind of different, a variety of ways of looking at causality, and they seem almost compatible with each other, or if you take one event, it seems like all four of them can be applied to that same event.
Well, actually, in the Garfield translation, he does. I forget exactly what, but he does give one situation as an example, and then it just shows how you can actually interpret that situation in terms of the four conditions. So yeah, it's definitely applicable to
Okay.
a lot of different conditions. Actually, I think he talked about switching the light on, and he talked about when you investigate the switching of the light on, you can ask what are the different conditions, and there'd be different ways of explaining for what reason the light came on.
So then would these be these would be four different aspects of causality? You could say when we analyze causality, these are four different aspects, and then Nāgārjuna wants to say, well, neither of these, none of these four really we can make sense of. So therefore we need to, discard the concept of causality, at least as it exists with Svabhava. Is that what's going on? Like there's multiple aspects here to the same concept?
I think that's right. Or I wouldn't necessarily frame it as multiple aspects, but more say it as, if we recall, Nāgārjuna is talking about causal relations as standing between things. And these four conditions are four kinds of things which could be said to be standing in a causal relation with an object. That being something that is like its immediate antecedent, which is its proximate condition. Something that, if it's an intentional object, like a thought, is the thing that it's about, which is its objective support. Something that it's like dominant condition, which is like its support. Like the example that is given for dominant condition is that like having an eye, or like the eye is the dominant condition for a visual cognition. Like it's something upon which that object depends, but it isn't like the primary cause, which in the case of the primary cause we might say is like, I don't know, the I actually don't know what might be said for for visual cognition. But these are like different objects which, when a given object arises, could be said to be part of the causal story of that object. And all of them could be said to be part of that causal story, but in different ways, I guess.
So I'm just wondering, the Abhidharmaka would want to say all four of these are true, right? Like these are all four valid analyses of causation, and Nāgārjuna is going through them systematically and showing none of them work out.
Yeah, I actually think Abhidharmaka would go even farther and say that, except for the proximate condition, which is the objective support, which is only relevant for cognitions, I think they might say that actually all of them have to be present for an object to arise. It needs a proximate condition and a primary cause and a dominant condition, I think that they might say.
Perhaps some people, perhaps one thing that might happen is that you might have all of these different conditions, but maybe one or two of them or a few of them are posited as like the most relevant. Maybe the other ones are just sort of co-present, but not necessarily essential. Or something, I don't know. And maybe Nāgārjuna will say that, you can talk about conditions like this, but none of them actually ultimately ground or give the final reason for why something is the way it is or why a situation is the way it is. Eric asked the question in the chat, is the dominant condition its intrinsic nature or essence? I would say the dominant condition is more so the reason for something without which that thing can't happen. So for the example with the turning on the light switch, the dominant condition, as Garfield explained, would be because we want to see. And if we didn't want to see, then there would be no reason for the light to be turned on, and all of the different mechanical and electric processes to occur for the light switch to turn on. So we can have the primary cause, the objective support, the proximate condition, but if we don't have the dominant condition, which is the reason for why something is the way it is, then it can't happen at all. Can anyone else give a good example of the dominant condition?
So if you give me a second, I'm looking in the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism right now for each of these four, because I think that
cool.
Another thing that I just remembered is in this era of classical Indian philosophy, there was a conflation with the word hetu, where it could mean like a physical cause or it could mean a reason. And the distinction wasn't made until, I believe, a few centuries afterwards, at least in the Buddhist context with at least Vasubandhu, Dignaga. So here, Nāgārjuna, like I think what's happening when we see dominant cause and then we also see like the primary cause, what's really happening is the dominant cause is more of this emphasis of like the actual the reason for its existence, and the primary cause is more of the actual like entity that causes its existence.
So the word being used here is not hetu, it's pratyaya, which I think that
there is hetu in the verse though, after pratyaya.
Yeah, that's something that's slightly confusing about this chapter is that causes and conditions are kind of like treated the same. And I mean, that might not be totally right, but that's what I'm getting. Is that a lot of what can be applied for causes and conditions can be applied to each other, even though they're not the same thing.
Okay, so
that was one of my big confusions.
Here's the example given in the dictionary. In the case of a perception of a tree by a moment of visual consciousness, the prior moment of consciousness that leads to this specific visual consciousness is the proximate condition. The tree is because it's the thing being seen, is the objective support. And the visual sense organ is the dominant condition. And the primary cause in this case, prior moment is the proximate, tree is the objective support, the eye is the dominant condition, and then it doesn't actually say what the...
Would that be like the act of seeing?
Well, the act of seeing is the effect, right? Is the visual cognition, I think.
Oh, okay.
Maybe sometimes things arise without a primary cause then. Maybe sometimes they just need a proximate condition and a dominant condition. I don't know.
It seems, especially when we're talking about a cognition, like in this example, it would be hard to think of what a primary cause could be when primary cause is understood as a relation between entities. And when we're not talking about a cognition, it would be hard to understand what a dominant condition would be, because in all these examples, it's the act of seeing or vision. But what would be the dominant condition when there is no cognition, right? So it's like these two kind of swap based on whether we're talking about cognition or the causality as it is.
I think we'll be able to elaborate some of this more when we get to the verses that deal with each of the different conditions. So I think for now we can move on to the fourth verse. An action does not possess conditions, nor is it devoid of conditions. Conditions are not devoid of an action, neither are they provided with an action.
So here is where we get to the temporal, or at least according to the commentary, to this temporal argument.
Right, of the three times.
Yeah. There's a really good set of diagrams that Jan Westerhoff has made for these. Can I share my screen? Am I able to?
I can make you host.
Okay, great. So if you think about the different possibilities that are being discussed in, I guess, 4, 5, 6.
So you can share your screen now.
Yeah, so if you think about 4, 5, and 6, the possibilities that are being discussed is the cause could occur. So the cause could be an object. Oh, someone's in the waiting room. Steven's in the waiting room. The cause could be something that occurs and then has gone out of existence already at the time when the effect arises. But this is rejected because that means that while it existed, it was not a cause because it didn't produce an effect. And while there is an effect, said effect cannot be said to have been caused because there's nothing there to cause it. Or they could be like this, where if we think of time as like existing in a series of moments, the cause could exist for the set of moments right before the effect is present. But the problem with this that Westerhoff points out is that here you still end up having an issue of there being notional dependence between the two. And the notional dependence, since what we have is not a single cause, but a causal field, the whole set of conditions, entails existential dependence if we think that collections of things are conceptual constructs rather than existing out in the world. So the way this argument works, right, is like if you have the cause and effect and they happen exactly after one another, it's still the case that this effect, like the first things being a cause, notionally depends upon the effect. But if it's being a cause notionally depends on it being an effect, then since it's a collection, the collection of things, collections, if they are notionally dependent on something, are existentially dependent on that, because according to Nāgārjuna, collections are merely notions. They are just, I don't know if I'm explaining this argument well. I feel like because this isn't something that Sideritz and Katsura touch on. I guess it might not be that relevant either, because Nāgārjuna doesn't really, it's more just like an additional thing that Westerhoff brings up to defend this argument against what a Sautrantika might say in response.
Well, I think it's so helpful because, I think they're definitely, especially reading Garfield's commentary and this other commentary that I'm also sort of looking at, which it's by a Zen teacher. Ooh. So I'm sort of referencing the different ones. And yeah, there's different ways of explaining the reasonings for each verse. So it's not just, exhaustive to what we're reading here in the Sideritz text. I actually sort of try to write my own or think of my own arguments too. And I'll try to read them out and you can let me know if they're successful or not. I mean, I guess not entirely my own. I probably borrowed them from other places too. But so if an action possessed conditions, it begs the question as to what further action in the conditions made the action that we're concerned about in the first place, which then begs the same question again about that action and its relationship to its conditions. So you basically end up having this infinite regress of relationships between actions and conditions just to explain the first action that you were concerned about. So you never actually get to explain the first action by means of talking about how it possessed conditions. So that doesn't hold because infinite regresses don't lead anywhere. If an action were devoid of conditions, it would just exist by itself for no reason. I actually think I got that from the Sideritz text. And if conditions were devoid of actions, then we can ask, how do conditions give rise to effects? If there's no causal power, to actually produce an effect, then a condition is just sort of sitting there, right, and not actually being a condition. So how do they give rise to effects? If conditions were provided with actions, then we can ask if the actions and conditions are identical or different, and we'll find false with both. And so thus we have to conclude in the negative that conditions are not provided with actions. So that's how I made sense on top of the commentary of this fourth verse. And perhaps we can, oh, hey, Stefan.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
No problem. You can catch up with the recording too.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we're on the fourth verse of the first chapter, and I think we're going to move on to 5 and 6 because they sort of all relate to each other. So yeah, just for the interest of time, maybe we can take blocks of verses now. So I'll read 5 and 6. 5. They are said to be conditions when something arises dependent on them. When something has not arisen, why then are they not non-conditions? And 6. Something cannot be called a condition whether the object that is the supposed effect is not yet existent or already existent. If non-existent, what is it the condition of? And if existent, what is the point of the condition?
This is still, I think, one of my favorite Nāgārjuna arguments, honestly. It's such an interesting thought.
There's such a huge difference between the translations. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, actually the one with the Zen master, very different translation. I haven't actually gone through the whole text, but I think this one is very much concerned with practice. So I think it's taking it from that lens. It takes a very cognitive approach rather than like a metaphysical one. But yeah, even and the Garfield one is also different, definitely very different, but similar.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell that they're essentially the same, but yeah, very interesting.
So if something is a condition of something else, then it seems like the first part 5, is like while the condition is present, the effect isn't there yet. So then it's not actually a condition yet. And if the effect is there, then the condition doesn't seem to be doing anything. How can something be said to be depending on a condition if it's there even after the condition has ceased? But then one way you might solve this is to claim that the condition, the length of time that the condition exists, and the length of time that the stretch of time that the effect exists, overlap, such that there's it's like this diagram where they overlap with each other. such that there's this period of time from T1 to T2 when this thing is the condition and its effect exists, but also like it's here, it has like the causal power, I guess. But I think the way you could respond to someone who said this as a solution to this is to say that this is just splitting up this, what is really two different entities here, one without causal powers and one with causal powers, and calling them one entity. But really only this part has the causal power, and it's just occurring simultaneously with something. But if two things are occurring simultaneously, how can you say which one is the condition and which one is the effect? So, and I think this kind of gets into what Nāgārjuna. I think this is actually something you could infer as a way to respond from the seventh verse too, because in the seventh verse he talks about how a dharma can't undergo change from being not causally efficacious to being causally efficacious. If it has causal efficacy, that's part of its intrinsic nature. It can't transform from not having it to having it and still remain the same thing. So because of this, the argument from the three times even works if you try to like say that they overlap and like coexist in the present, but also fail to coexist because they also exist in the past and future as well. I don't know if I'm going anywhere with that.
So I find that diagram that you referred to helpful in understanding this. Can you go back to it, please?
Yeah. Oh wait, whoops, is this? No. Okay, yeah.
So, when you say that someone that's attempting to disprove this of Nāgārjuna's would say that perhaps the cause and effect could coexist for a period of time,
Yeah.
would that correspond to a Sankhya position?
I don't know, actually. Maybe. I have no idea.
Because it seems like that argument is very easy to disprove to me. For the following reasons. One, that you're essentially saying that the cause and the effect coexist for a period of time as the same thing, right? So, in other words,
I think they're saying they are still different things. They're just like,
no, but that's not possible, because the effect rises from the cause, right? And if the effect arises from the cause, it has to be the same.
I
But
see.
But if it's the same, then there is no separate thing, cause and effect. You see what I'm saying? It's a problem of the one and the many.
If you have a seed and it's taken to be the cause for a sprout, and you wanted to say that there's a brief period during which the seed has not yet ceased, but the sprout exists, this would be very strange, because clearly the process that we see when a seed becomes, when we say a seed causes a sprout, is really that under certain conditions a seed becomes a sprout.
Mm-hmm.
And so there can't be this brief period when you have both a seed in existence and a sprout in existence.
Yeah, exactly.
As soon as you have a sprout in existence, there's no seed because the sprout has sprouted from the seed.
Exactly.
That's a good. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, it's essentially like a problem of saying, like, now you could say, and this is my problem, this is where I've always struggled with this. If you get rid of the cause and effect designation, well, this is probably getting a little bit past the point of the verse. But essentially, if you get rid of the cause and effect designation and you just say it's just one cause that's changing over time, then how how can you not say that that cause exists, right? But that's a separate question.
Well, I actually don't think that that's what he's saying. I don't think that because I don't think that the reason why Nāgārjuna thinks a sprout doesn't arise is because it's really just a transformation of the seed. I think that saying that it's a transformation of the seed could also just be rephrased in terms of event causality, like saying the event of the seed sprouting is a cause for the event of, like, I don't know, the sprout leaving the ground. And I think even if you said this, Nagarjuna's arguments could still work. You'd have to rephrase them, but I think that they might still be applicable. So if it's the case that some of these arguments can be applied to causality described in terms of events as well, then, I mean, if we're dispensing with events arising, it's unclear how it could make sense to say that there's some seed or sprout that does actually exist and is transforming into the other, because there's no transformation event taking place.
Right. Yeah.
I think it,
Understand the problem. The problem is the idea of like the origin of the effect. Where does the effect come from? Does it come from all of the conditions being present, or does it come from, which is another word of saying, like, this gets into the actually like kind of the sticky issue of the distinction, like the specifically Buddhist epistemological distinction between like cause and condition, which I don't understand. I can't claim to understand that.
I think
I just want to say,
go ahead.
yeah, I just want to say something I think might be helpful here. If we're relating like that diagram with, cause coexisting with an effect and they're kind of overlapping or something like that, and whether or not, if we have something, we're talking about it in one moment, a cause and an effect are existing, whether or not that's two separate things, or if they can be considered to be the same thing. And then we're relating this kind of to a process of like the seed becoming a sprout. It might be helpful to think of a process ontology here just for a second, because from a process standpoint, there could you like basically the seed and the sprout could be part of the same moment, be part of the same process, and wouldn't be fundamentally different, even though they're separate they're separate events like over time. If you consider the process, which is the unit that exists over time, you still have a kind of a simultaneity there. And so if you're talking about like interacting with the seed versus interacting with the sprout, it could be similar to say interacting with if you think about it in terms of time, you could look at the sprout and you could say, okay, you can interact with the top of the sprout or the bottom of the sprout, and those things are coexisting, at the same time. It's going to be different whether you're interacting with the stem or if you touch the leaf or you touch like a flower at one point. They're going to be different. They can't be said to be the same thing, because it's going to change the meaning of the relationship of effect, of the way that we might affect that. So similarly, if you're interacting with the seed versus with the sprout, things that exist separate in time, you're still interacting with the same process. Similar to like if you're touching one part of a tree versus another part of the tree, it's the same tree. Well, touching one part of the process, the seed or the sprout, it's the same process. You're just touching a different part of it. They can't be said to be the same because, if you mess with a seed, for instance, maybe you're going to completely throw off its entire genealogy and its entire plan versus, the kind of what could be. So they basically, the seed and the sprout can be said to be different, even though they can just as easily be said to be kind of part of the same process and happening simultaneously as a process. Sorry if that doesn't make any sense, but I feel like it was important to introduce kind of a bit of a process ontology there.
I had a point to that. So like I'm not sure if this is exactly what you mean, Brian, but like at the beginning of Sideritz, he talks about how causation in the classical Indian context is understood as a relationship between two different entities, and not as in, he contrasts this with modern science as a relation between two events. And is this kind of what you mean by process ontology, that if we understand causation as two events, we understand this relationship a bit differently than Nāgārjuna is understanding it? And I guess then the question would be like, do you think his critiques still apply? That the same critiques that he applies to events, do you think to entities, do you think they would apply to events?
Well, yeah, just because in the same, I mean, because you could think of the events as a relationship between entities, the seed and the sprout, just as you could think of the relationship between like the soil and the tree existing at the same time, they're two separate entities. That's that relational framework that Nāgārjuna seems to be working with, as opposed to a relationship between events. It kind of just brings under the same, a process ontology kind of brings those things under the same logical framework, because then
I guess
what a process, the seed and the tree are just different parts of, or different entities in a sense.
I guess like as soon as we attempt to conceptualize this in terms of processes, and like, the Nāgārjunian kind of deconstruction would then be like, well, can processes exist with Swabhava? And maybe it just goes down this infinite regress. So there's really no, for a second I thought maybe we could salvage this understanding of causation, but I think that he would just say, well, same critiques apply, and processes can't exist with Swabhava either.
If I may interject here a little bit, I want to like bring people's attention back to the verse for a sec, because like what we're talking about and the discussion in terms of like modern concepts of like causation, like I think that's actually like probably a better conversation for like a different chapter, like in terms of like, well, motion, the second chapter maybe, time, stuff like that. And like I just want to like kind of bring people's focus to like the what exactly is the concept that's being presented here. It's the concept of like conditions, right? So we've been using this example of the seed and the tree or the root or whatever. But you can say, well, the seed and the tree are the same entity at two different moments in time. That's maybe like a modern physics way of understanding that. But there's a problem. The problem is that what do you need to have in order for the tree to arise? And that's the concept of conditions, right? And so what we're talking about is neither the cause nor the effect. It's the conditions. And so the conditions are really, really important, right? And when you're talking about conditions, it's actually more in line with like a modern concept of cause, right? What do you need? Now you can call the seed the root cause or the root condition. It's the term in English maybe gets muddy a little bit. But here we're talking about like something that's, neither an event nor really a cause. We're talking about all the background of stuff that's happening in order for the seed in modern science. This is the way of thinking. Seed is programmed to become tree, therefore seed is inherently tree. No, the seed is not inherently a tree, because in order for seed to become tree, there's all these things that need to happen. You see what I mean? I think that's more, if we start thinking, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I would be reticent to bring too much of the process perspective into the play, because there's a way in which it can become like a reified thing. Like there's a way in which it cannot, I guess. There's definitely a way in which you can think about it as a process, and it's helpful of seeing like, oh, that's more, but it's almost as if I want to like caution people from taking this view of like, oh, if we stepped out and we saw the universe from a God's eye view, we would see that the tree and the seed are the same thing. That's a complicated picture, right? That's all I'm trying to say is I just want to like bring people's attention to the fact that we're talking about something. It's not exactly like, as I'm sure you all are aware, that can be completely mapped onto like a process.
I guess I only invoked it just to try to say that causal relationship in space and causal relationship in time are not fundamentally different, which is my comment on your interpretation of the diagram that was shown earlier. Just that if you're thinking about a causal relationship in space, doesn't necessarily mean it would be different. It would basically the causal critiques to the causal relationships in space versus like some two things coexisting at the same time, a cause and effect, should apply to causal relationships happening over time. That's all. That was mainly the reason why I brought up the process thing, was just to kind of draw an equivalence between space and time there.
Right.
Well, I'm glad that we did bring out process thought, and it's definitely something we and I agree. Other verses might be good to talk about that. What was I going to say? Oh, and I think, yeah, it is important, I think, to bear in mind that I think taking a sort of practical, or rather than just overly philosophical approach, might actually help elucidate some of these issues of interpretation, because, you know, we can sort of philosophically, metaphysically talk about like how, you know, something that's a cause and effect are actually aspects of the same process, sure, but how does that help us, for example, actually get trees from seeds, right? When what are the conditions that actually allow us to get trees from seeds? And when you take that approach, you know, it kind of doesn't matter whether or not we're talking about substance ontologies or process ontologies. We're literally just talking about conditions and how they give rise to their effects. But I just wanted to say that, yeah, I resonate with what Stefan said.
Right, and I just to clarify, just to make sure that what I was saying wasn't totally taken the wrong way. The reason why that it's still kind of helpful is because we can think the same way of like, how does the condition of like, let's say a tree existing right now in one moment, there's still conditions as far as how like if we say that the trunk is like the root cause of the flower of like the leaves, there's still conditions that have to apply in order for the trunk to continue causing the leaves, for instance. So I guess I just think making that equivalence makes Nāgārjuna's critique just kind of apply in more spaces, to more kinds of causality.
I see that. I see that's a good point.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I wasn't trying to say that bringing up process ontology isn't helpful. In fact, I think it provides like a good like kind of outside perspective on this from which to think from, because I think it's easier for us to do so.
I think it's important to ask the question at a certain point of what exactly we mean by condition, and if condition is sort of a set of circumstances that pertains, then at a certain point you have to expand to match those circumstances, at least in your understanding, or be at risk, you know, face the danger of being subject to something of which you're unaware. So if we talk about conditions in that manner, I think we run the risk of conducting ourselves as if we were generals, you know, as if we're overlooking a battlefield. Whereas if we talk about conditioner, to be a little light lighthearted with my language. I mean, if it's goop that goes in your hair, you don't give a shit about it by the time it goes down the drain. The condition has been attained. Your hair is soft. Whereas if you're sort of determining which circumstances are the ones that kind of dictate the lay of the land and which are the ones that you have to grasp, you are kind of intrinsically invoking authorship. And it's a question of sort of who's the subject. And this is why I think the expression grasp and use but never name is really helpful.
Well, to that point about definitions, Garfield actually provides some definitions of causes and conditions that might be helpful, just to help us get clarity on that. When Nāgārjuna uses the word cause or hetu, he has in mind an event or state that has in it a power, kriya, to bring about its effect and has that power as a part of its essence or nature, svabhava. When he uses the term condition, on the other hand, pratyaya, he has in mind an event, state, or process that can be appealed to in explaining another event, state, or process without any metaphysical commitment to any occult connection between explanandum and explanandums.
So I guess understanding these definitions, I think clears a lot of this up. If Nāgārjuna is critiquing this notion of cause having svabhava of some sort, then why is it that the cause can't just produce the effect with its intrinsic nature? Why does it need to rely on these other conditions or this causal nexus around it to produce the effect? So I guess this critique has like a new layer, but I was also wondering, like, how do we distinguish a cause from its conditions? I guess Garfield gives us a really obvious distinction. A cause is that which has causal power, and a condition is that which kind of does some subsidiary work to enable the cause to produce the effect. And I was wondering, does everyone think this is a neat distinction? And I think, to me, it doesn't seem like one. And I think Nāgārjuna is precisely targeting this, especially if we're going to psychologize causality and to see, like, actually what we conceptualize as a cause and what we conceptualize as a condition is like completely up to our own interests. And, also, like, we can anticipate if we have a particular cause, we think of it as a cause and we anticipate a certain effect, we need to imbue it with our anticipation to then see that the cause becomes an effect. Or, like, vice versa, if we have an effect, we need to impart it with our memory to understand that there is a cause to that effect. And I guess this conceptualization plays a huge role in actually distinguishing cause and condition when there really is no precise or neat natural kind or whatever between these two.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it seems like a main point is definitely that, these categories of even cause and condition, cause and effect, these are notions that we impute on processes that we see or make a relationship, or in which we see a relationship, but they don't have those aspects in and of themselves. One interesting, funny way you can think about it is like how, when we look at charcoal in the store, we can call it fuel, but it's not actually fuel right now, right? It's not actually a cause for fire. It's literally just a lump of charcoal. But when it's actually in the fire pit, that's when we can say that it's functioning as fuel and being one of the conditions that allow fire to happen. So I think part of what's being emphasized here is, how deeply our categorizations relate to our analysis of causes and conditions. And the way that Garfield defines cause and conditions, I get a sense that he almost gives a ontic weight to causality and a epistemic weight to conditionality. So conditions are what we sort of refer to explain a set of circumstances having arisen, whereas a cause is that which actually, you know, in reality does the work, does the actual work of producing. So in that sense, they can be almost the same, I think. It's just, I guess, how you understand it can shift depending on what you're emphasizing. I don't know. And I do want to say also that we should make a few points about these verses and then continue. Do you have something to say, Aditya?
Oh no. Yeah, no. Maybe we should move on because we're spending a lot of time. But I was like, I had this insight that maybe like what Nāgārjuna is getting us to do whenever I read him, and you know, I'm reading him also in the Vaidalya Prakarana now, is that you brought up this ontic epistemological distinction, and I wonder does anyone get this feeling that he is kind of, he's targeting these distinctions and having us see that, you know, these are not properly defined distinctions. Like same thing with cause and conditions in this chapter. Same thing with, you know, maybe movement and mover in the next one. But I get the sense that what he's saying is that there is no neat distinction between ontology or epistemology, or what it is that there exists, and how it is that we know them is all like intertwined. Does anyone get the sense, or is it just me?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes.
Oh, sorry. You continue.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes I feel like, you know, these different aspects of, you know, knowledge that you might see divided in philosophy, in Western philosophy, like ontology, epistemology, or even aesthetics and ethics. They're all just sort of this intertwined chain in Buddhism. You know, it's this ontological, epistemological, ethics, or I don't know if we can make like a conjunction. It's like onto-epistemological, aesthetical, ethics. You know, it's like you can't really distinguish all of those different aspects from each other. They're definitely part of the same thing. It's not like there's an ontological way things exist, and our epistemology is an effort to try to correspond to that ontological nature. It's more so our epistemic apparatus is what produces the sense of the ontological existence of things, which also influences the aesthetic apprehension of phenomena. You know, to the extent we understand how, you know, how phenomena are actually the result of our cognitive activity and our karmic traces and such. And then there's the ethics that go into that as well, in terms of like, you know, the values that drive you, and how that's driven by your karma as well, and etc. But yeah, I definitely agree that I think Nāgārjuna, one of the purposes of this text and his project is to upset those distinctions that we might habitually operate with. And one thing I've also noticed that someone may have caught is that when Siddharitha and Katsura, what Siddharitha and Katsura translates as primary cause, Garfield translates as efficient condition. So it's interesting that conflation happening. Yeah. But yeah, can we move on to, let's say, the next three verses, which all refer to dharma specifically? So 7, 8, and 9. Since a dharma does not operate whether existent, non-existent, or both existent and non-existent, how in that case can something be called an operative cause? 8. A dharma, being existent, is said to indeed be without objective support. Then why again posit an objective support in the case of a dharma without an objective support? And 9. Destruction does not hold when dharmas have not yet originated. Thus, nothing can be called a proximate condition. If it is destroyed, how can it be a condition? So here we're already going through some of those different kinds of conditions and refuting them as intrinsically existent. And I think at this point of the chapter, I think it's starting to become clear that what we're really identifying as the issue is this intrinsic existence of of the causes and conditions, and that we're sort of presupposing that when we think about a dharma, we are thinking about an intrinsically existent real, and that's what we're operating with. And yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on what Aditya was saying before and kind of try to tie it into these verses. I would say that I think it's pretty clear here in these verses that if you get the sense that he's trying to destroy these definitions, then I think that's pretty accurate. And I would go as far as to say that that's the purpose. That's the whole point. That if the concepts of like, well, what exactly is a cause? What exactly is a condition anyway? If that's starting to get fuzzy for you, I think that that's not your confusion. I think that that's you're thinking about it and you're saying, wait a minute, like these definitions have problems. And if like your conception of ontology and epistemology, if the boundaries start to get a little blurry, well, I think that's the first step. And I think that that would lead to the question of the goal, but I'll leave that aside for now. But yeah, I think that's clearly the purpose, is to say that how could one propose an operative cause or productive cause? That's how Garfield translates it. In the first place, as in like you've got a concept, root cause, productive cause, whatever you want to call it. And he's saying that that's not a tenable concept. That's what I think that verse is saying.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. And I think it's the whole vibe I'm getting from this section of verses is the frustration and kind of a surrender, leading to a sort of surrender of our feeling of having a grasp on causality. And, maybe the result of that is, because if we do believe we have a grasp on causality, we think that we can then reproduce and cause kind of self-cause, or we can hold on to and create, causal structures, which I think would lead more so to kinds of attachment, which would upset, cycles, maybe 12 links or samsaric cycle. If we believe we have a grasp on the causal structures of things, that we think that we can just be this abiding self and, generate these, just place things in the right places. And these are the conditions for that. And I'm going to cause this. And we kind of become the general or whatever of our experience. Whereas if we realize that all of that's kind of not really how causality works, we kind of are driven to surrender. And, if causality doesn't actually function like that, then we actually aren't in control, as it turns out.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would qualify it a little bit as we're not in control in the way we thought we were. Because you don't want to slip to the other side and say, oh, since we don't have control, we don't have any control at all. I think that would actually be part of this sort of dichotomous thinking that Nāgārjuna is actually trying to help us get rid of. And with the very first verse, which is an important thing to understand with this kind of Buddhist philosophy, is that binary or dichotomous thinking can actually be extrapolated into these four categories. So there's also both and neither. Though we should also understand that the both and neither are just extrapolations of the sort of positive and negative kind of orientation. I like number 7. Just because it's some interesting argument so like a dharma being a cause, let's say, for it to be a cause, it would actually have to perform the action. It has to perform itself being a cause. And in the act of performance, when something performs, it changes in some way, right? It goes from one state to another, from a state of not performing to a state of performing. And maybe we can also say to a state of having been performed. But if that were the case, then a dharma can't be an operative cause, because a dharma is supposed to be this intrinsically existing momentary entity. But if it goes through changes, then it's not actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. And I thought that was a very interesting point.
And this then goes back to why the overlapping cause and effect is untenable, because that's positing a part of the cause or a part of time during which the cause isn't having any causal efficacy because the effect doesn't exist, and another part when it does have causal efficacy because now the effect does exist. But that doesn't make sense because it can't have changed from having not been performing that causal activity to having performed it. It's one thing with an intrinsic nature. It can't be composed of different, sometimes appearing, sometimes not appearing natures. Then it's not actually an ultimate existent anymore. It would be more properly expressed in terms of, different things. It could still be decomposed under analysis at that point.
Right. And then you might ask, okay, like what about maybe one of the decomposed parts, that's the true cause, but then you still end up in the same issues.
Exactly. You run into the issues discussed previously. If you decompose this cause that for part of time it doesn't perform causality, and for the next time it is performing that, the part that's not performing it just isn't a cause. So it clearly can't be the cause. And the part that is occurring simultaneously with the effect. So couldn't you just as well say that what you're calling the effect could be the cause rather than being the effect? Once you've collapsed to this point of things just arising simultaneously, you have no way to decide which things to call a cause and which things to call an effect. And this, I guess, raises maybe the direction that I feel like this is going into, and what I think Sideritz and Katsura mention, which is that, I guess I'll just read it directly, the relation of production or causation must be conceptually constructed. It is something that we impute upon observing a succession of events, but it is not to be found in reality.
Nice. Yeah, and the second part is very simple. If it doesn't exist, then it's not being a cause. And I guess that's obvious, but I guess Nāgārjuna is trying to be thorough and going through all the different logical possibilities, just in case someone tries to sneak in an explanation somewhere. And then it can't be both either. And here we have another example of the typical formula, which is, okay, if positive and negative don't work, then both can't work just because of the previous two. And I think another thing we can sort of say with this is that sometimes, and I had this sort of sense in the beginning too, sometimes I see people think that Madhyamaka reasoning is actually sort of going against the grain of logic, of established logical principles, for example, the principle of the excluded middle. Here we have a clear case of the fact that that's not actually being denied, because we're not positing a third logical possibility that we can accept, because we're actually accepting that that for something that exists and non-exists is a contradiction, it's a contradictory state. And because of that, we are rejecting it. So I think just to say from the outset, this is a good example of how Nāgārjuna's Madhyamaka reasoning is not at all against established formal logical principles. It's more so showing how they just don't necessarily apply to ultimate reality, but we still can and should abide by them. But maybe we can say more about why the both and reasoning doesn't work.
So priest's interpretation is inaccurate.
See, that's interesting because one, I am not super into logic enough to even get anywhere near studying paraconsistent logic as something I'm interested in. I'm being clear here. I'm just going off of vibes. The vibe doesn't seem super right to me in the direction. It seems like they're sort of trying to make it work as a kind of system that's contradictory but makes sense. In my impulse is to see how it's all still coherent and consistent, just not in an explicable way, not in a way that
this is so in my MA thesis, this is the road I'm taking. I'm arguing against the fact that that this is a genuine antinomy, and that actually if we kind of reveal some of the presuppositions in this seeming paradox, we see that it's not really a paradox anymore.
Right.
Actually, his thought becomes a lot more clear and logically consistent with classical logic. But yeah, but sorry, I had a question about how convincing is this verse 7, because I can think of, so I really can, it seems to me that it's only convincing if you have these abhidharmika assumptions about the momentariness of a dharma. But if we don't have this assumption, couldn't we say that, okay, so like I can think of a couple options here. So if we have like fundamental particles that comprise the world, one option could be that these dharmas are context and time sensitive. So a dharma has in its nature to perform at like time 1 or time 2, and then to stop performing at time 3. And the time contextuality can be built into its intrinsic nature. And I don't see why that can't be the case. And then secondly, even if
would it really be an intrinsic nature if, like, can at time t and only at time this blue object turns red? Is that really an intrinsic property of the object, or is that, I mean, is that really not intrinsic, is that really a property of the object that we would want to say it has independently of other things? That seems to be precisely an example of something that does not, or that like would be, if we wanted to reanalyze it in terms of really actually independent objects, we would say this is like an object, and then at time t there's a different object which has the property of blueness, and then at time t+1 there's another object that has the property of, you know, whatever.
I think the easy answer to the question you just asked is it depends. Like, it depends on what the thing is in question. Like if you have an object that turns blue because it just there's some kind of chemical reaction and it just like somehow completely changed chemical nature, then maybe yes, maybe it did change intrinsically, quote unquote.
Well, then in that case, I don't think I've ever heard of any things which have in their intrinsic nature a change that is not itself underlied by some change in its actual constituents. I guess I'm finding it very hard to conceptualize of an actual ultimate existent whose intrinsic independent nature is to be one way at one time and another way at another time.
There's a point that this is actually a good segue into a more general concern I wanted to bring up, which is that it's very interesting, and maybe I'm going a little ahead of myself with the whole text, but it's very interesting in how in Madhyamaka analysis, we can actually have a sort of conceptually coherent idea of an ultimate existent, an ultimate existent with an intrinsic nature, and for there to be, so we can think in terms of for there to be an ultimate existent, it must be this and that way, and it can only be that way. But then we also refute it. And I find that really interesting, that there is a way in which we can know that an ultimate existent, if it were to exist, must have such and such qualities or properties, even though in the end of the day, we're denying it.
I just wanted to respond quickly to Sagar. My rebuttal was kind of just, it wasn't well thought out, and I just wanted to try and understand it in a different way. But I mean, to push back, maybe we can say that the intrinsic property isn't blueness or it isn't redness. If we wanted to say exhaust the intrinsic properties of a thing, we could say we give a long list of blueness at time 1 to time 2, redness at time 2 to time 3, and so on. And so the intrinsic property isn't just one of these, but it's rather all of them put together sort of conjunction. But also, I see even as I'm speaking, I see the worry in this is that to even understand what a thing is, and to say that some property is intrinsic to that thing, we kind of need it to have an intrinsic property to kind of pin down that thing as a thing. And so it's kind of trying to reverse the order, because first, in order to even have a thing and then to say, well, it has properties A, B, C, and so on, and to list all the properties, we actually need to first pinpoint a thing, and to pinpoint a thing, we need to have an intrinsic property to say, well, it's this one thing that is undergoing change.
Exactly.
And,
right. If
yeah.
we want to say that this thing is of the nature to be red at this time and blue at that time, and we want to distinguish this from at this time there is a blue thing and at this time there's a different red thing, then there has to be some property that we think is more intrinsic than those two, which is allowing us to differentiate these two pictures and say that the first one, they really are the same thing. But if that's the case, then we're really just saying that thing is the real intrinsic property and the other stuff is just being replaced. The other problem that I would raise with this is that I guess if we wanted to propose that such things could exist, ultimately real entities which have these temporally mediated properties, it just seems like every time we might want to propose an example of such a thing, we would find that our example actually would be better described as actually changing into another thing altogether. Like with what Stephen said with the chemical reaction, if we wanted to propose that some existent in the world, something is this type of entity, I think that we would in general find that we would, after a bit of analysis, be more likely to choose the other description. And you said, when I asked for an example, God, but I actually think this precisely is one of the reasons why many people find, or why at least a lot of Indian Buddhist philosophers, because of this idea of changing, of seemingly needing to change from a creative state, from a non-creative state to a creative state, or through different creative states as different things are actualized by God, while also being said to be eternally the same. And I think it's precisely this problem which made to Indian Buddhist philosophers who discuss the topic the idea of God very intuitive, or of a creator God that is very unintuitive.
So
Yeah.
I just want to point out we're almost at the end of the second hour, so let's try to get through the verses quicker. But you can make your point, Stefan.
Sure. I just want to say that I don't think that you have to jump all the way to a truly existent thing. Like, I don't think you have to jump all the way to a god. I think that the concept that's being attacked here is a self, a truly existent. Now we're talking about objects like dharmas in this chapter, but you can think about us, a self of an object, like think of the Platonic concept of I don't know, just somethingness, treeness, those types of things, which maybe are more salient. I'm gonna, speculate here that maybe they were more salient, this concept, in other ancient times. Maybe our modern scientific brains have a hard time thinking well, is there anything really to a tree at the end of the day? It's just atoms and stuff. But yeah, I think that what's being attacked here is the concept of a self to things. That's, and if that doesn't make intuitive sense to you, yeah, maybe it does. Maybe for others it does, who come from a certain other type of background in terms of their thinking. Or yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, just to sort of riff off a little bit of that point, one of the interesting things I find about these kinds of verses is that I feel like depending on your mind and your receptivity and your pre-existing receptivity to ideas of or a sense of no self, maybe one or a few of these verses can help you trigger that understanding very well. But some people need a lot of these verses to slowly chip away. And the reason why I'm reading this multiple times is because I need lots of chipping away at my assumption of inherent existence. And it's nice to get all these different arguments to do that. there's almost like almost no ultimate argument that will actually lead you to a kind of conceptual cognition of emptiness. You kind of have to keep chipping away at that strong assumption of svabhava. I want to move through 8 and 9 really quickly because I think there are a few sentences that actually explain the reasoning quite well. So for number 8, a dharma being existent, it is said to indeed be without objective support. Then why again posit an objective support in the case of a dharma without an objective support? And the reasoning given for that is at the time when a cognition exists, its supposed objective support cannot be said to produce it. Only something that does not yet exist can be produced. So, a cognition can't really exist simultaneously with its objective support, and then you say that the objective support gives rise to the cognition, because causality is a sequence, it's not a simultaneity. And if the objective support does not exist yet, then the cognition doesn't exist yet. So you can't say there's a causal relationship. For number 9, destruction does not hold when dharmas have not yet originated. Thus, nothing can be called a proximate condition. If it is destroyed, how can it be a condition? Here, the reasoning is that before the effect has arisen, the condition has not yet undergone destruction. And once it has undergone destruction, since it no longer exists, it cannot be said to be productive in effect. And I think that's really interesting, an interesting argument. So before the effect has actually had a chance to come up, the condition for that effect hasn't been destroyed yet. So it can't be really called a proximate condition. The thing that comes immediately before the arising end of an effect. But once a proximate condition has been destroyed, meaning has fulfilled its moment, it can't be said to be productive in effect because it's been destroyed. I just find that interesting. Does anyone want to say anything on that, or is that straightforward, more or less? Okay, we can just keep moving. I think just for the interest of time, let's group all the remaining ones together, and maybe we can just try to talk about some general, we can have some general reflections about the whole chapter as well. So just to finish off, number 10, since things devoid of intrinsic nature are not existent, this existing, that comes to be, can never hold. 11, that product does not exist in the conditions, whether they are taken separately or together. What does not exist in the conditions, how can that come from the conditions? 12, if that which does not exist in them is produced from those conditions, how is it that the product does not also come forth from non-conditions? 13, the product consists of the conditions, but the conditions do not consist of themselves. How can that which is a product of things that do not consist of themselves consist of conditions? And 14, therefore, neither a product consisting of conditions nor one consisting of non-conditions exists. If the product does not exist, how can there be a condition or non-condition? And just to sort of guide some of the last discussion, I think focusing a little bit on the last verse would be really nice, because I think it's like a concluding verse that helps us sort of reflect on the whole chapter.
So I just want to make a comment on this last verse, because it's kind of the conclusion, and it takes the arguments that are being made before it kind of like for granted. Like, we've already established the conditions don't have essence, and as such, this follows. But I just wanted to back up to like verse 11, like in the several, well, I'm reading the Garfield translation, but in the several or united conditions, the effect cannot be found. How could something not in the conditions come from the conditions? And this is where my mind immediately goes to, well, I can think of other plausible ideas. Like I can think of alternative hypotheses. But I think, and I just wanted to ask people's opinion on this. Is there any aspect of the argument that it appears like something is taken for granted? For me, it's this verse 11 where there seems to be some kind of like assumption of like, well, why can't an effect that's not found in the conditions just arise? And for me, it's because the conditions are present, the effect arises. And so if they're, how can it not arise? Why wouldn't it spontaneously arise from non-conditions seems kind of a silly statement to me, because of course different things arise when you put different things together, and then things happen. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's an assumption here about parts and wholes and how they are interdependent and don't exist intrinsically. I think even this argument is something you see with the dharmas, and like my thought was, why is it that the dharmas cannot change because they are static and exist with their intrinsic nature, and they can't be something that isn't in their intrinsic nature? Then why is it not a combination of dharmas that can lead to change or an interaction between them? But I think there's an implicit assumption here that there is no such thing as a whole, where a whole can have a property that none of its parts have, because Nāgārjuna wants to say, well, where does this property come from if it doesn't exist in any of the parts?
Yeah, I feel like one argument you can always sort of put up for yourself is sort of, is it identical or different from the parts? And you usually always find an issue. If a whole is identical to its parts, what's the point of the parts? If the whole is different from the parts, then what's the relationship between the parts and the whole?
It's still, I think that you guys hit the nail on the head with the assumption being that the definition of a dharma, because they're using a very specific definition here of like, well, it's already assumed to be some kind of like intrinsic thing. But if it's not, if it's something that's less intrinsic than that, then I don't see. I guess what I'm trying to say is that like, if we just attack on the term relative, right? Like if there's like relative conditions, and then the relative effect arises from the relative conditions, like as they're conventionally designated. Like if you attach too much weight to the definitions, I can see why there could be a problem. But if you don't attach too much weight to the definitions, I don't see why there's a problem with this statement.
Sorry, can you go back? Which statement in particular?
Like in the Garfield translation, it's in the several or united conditions, the effect cannot be found. So the effect cannot be found before it's this problem of like temporality again, of like, when does the effect arise? Like that problem. And for me, there seems to be a little bit of a jump in reasoning here, or I could be wrong, because the argument being made is the effect can't be found in the conditions, and therefore, how could it even happen in the first place? Well, before you bring the conditions together, of course the effect doesn't occur, but then you bring them together.
I think that the argument is not that. I think the argument is that a thing is a condition if it does this, it has this causal power. At the time when the effect exists, but the conditions have ceased, then the effect is not an effect because it's not resulting from some conditions. And at the time when the conditions exist, but the effect has yet to be created, those things are not conditions yet because they have not done any causal activity. Now you might then say, okay, but that's not an existential interdependence. That's just a notional interdependence. But because the conditions are, there's multiple of them, they're really, as you yourself brought up before, being brought together as a causal field of some sort. And that is a conceptual activity, to take these all together and say that this is a causal field. Aggregating things or collecting things, according to most Buddhist analyses, is conceptual activity. These collections don't exist out there independent of our conceptualization. So if a collection is notionally dependent on something, then the collection is existentially dependent on that because collections are notional entities. So this demonstrates then the interdependence, that a thing, the cause doesn't exist without the effect, and the effect doesn't exist without the cause, but neither of them simultaneously occur, which means there aren't out there in the world, independent of our conceptualization, real causes and effects. I think that this is more the argument rather than the previous argument about the effect not existing in the cause. I think that the second argument about time has a more far-reaching implications, I guess, because it would mean, I guess, that anything which essentially as part of its nature is taken to be part of some causal story that lasts over a period of time actually is unreal, or rather that our conception of it isn't actually how it could possibly be.
In other words, what you're trying to say is that the designation of something as a bundle of conditions you have to make that distinction first before you start talking about any of this stuff.
I mean, that's not exactly what I was saying, but I do think that's true, or that's an implication of what I was saying, is that the mental constructing process of aggregating things together, in this case to produce some entity called a causal field, is a prerequisite conceptual activity for any causal story, meaning that, again, as Sideritz and Katsura say, causality, the relation of causation is conceptually constructed.
Yeah.
Yes. Would you say that's basically one of the key points to take away from this chapter, is that we can't find specific causes and conditions and the effects which arise from that, other than what we impute through our conceptual apparatuses.
That's right.
Social conventions.
The causal relation is a conceptually imputed one, not one that exists out in the world. And what is interesting about this, and the way I think it gets to the ultimate point that things don't arise, is if the causal relation is a conceptual construct, then that means that anything which is taken to arise by means of some other cause can't exist as we are taking it to, which means that is the object that we are taking to exist actually doesn't exist.
And I think that's the point of verse 10, where it says, this existing that comes to be can never hold.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So
Things that come to be exist but through that causal framework or by conditions or borrows its existence from conditions can never hold. And I think that's it. What's interesting about that is, again, it suggests a kind of or pushes us towards a kind of surrender, because we could maybe set up conditions by which we might want to generate certain effects. But if we've generated certain effects by setting up certain conditions, and those effects are never going to hold.
Right, exactly. It's just all, it's true with reference to our conventions, but those conventions don't have any substantial existence. And you know what's crazy about this is people often say that because of the way Nāgārjuna writes, or because of the nature of the Madhyamaka project, you can't really have an ultimate argument for emptiness, one that shows everything to be empty. But some arguments get pretty close. Like this argument seems like if this argument works, it seems like almost everything, almost all concrete objects are objects that we take to be essentially part of some causal stories. And if all causal stories are merely conceptual fictions, then anything that's essentially part of a causal story is a conceptual fiction too, or rather its existence and properties are conceptually mediated. So there's a ton of stuff that I think this argument shows to be empty, even if it doesn't show everything to be empty.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree in the sense that there are some kinds of arguments that are very, hard hitting, and I think we can say that maybe a lot of the most major, Madhyamaka arguments, in principle, can be an ultimate, argument for emptiness. I guess the point I was trying to make previously is that depending on who you are as an individual person with your own historical karmic circumstances, you might need a lot to chip away at that assumption. Though in principle, you can use something. In principle, I think for some people, certain arguments might just be sufficient. And you might find that over time, one or two kinds of arguments help you a lot that you can put into meditation, and then that gets you to that at the very least conceptual cognition of emptiness.
Right, because it's often said that even though there's no ultimate argument for emptiness, the process of showing individual things to be empty one by one still can lead to people realizing emptiness, because they start to realize after enough iterations of this process of being shown this is empty and this is empty, that anything that they try to say, okay, but what about this, will end up getting shown to be empty too. They realize that even though they haven't seen every single instantiation of this method, that it would work on anything. And some people might see that even after seeing the first instantiation of this. They might see it once and realize, wait, this is a set of methods and a set of ways of thinking about the world which would show anything I tried to treat as substantial to be insubstantial. So
including that method.
Including that method.
Yeah.
Including the method. And that's why I wanted to get to a certain topic, which is probably jumping the gun, which is if an argument, I think it's most helpful to me. I really like the verse, by Shakyamuni, where he says, you have to test my words like you test the purity of gold. Because I think that thinking about why something can be wrong is even better than thinking about why it can be right in a lot of these instances. Because doubts, if you start to have doubts about this, you can see how it's only true. Some of these arguments are only true from a certain point of view. Or they're only true from a certain set of assumptions, or they're only true within the framework of a certain set of definitions and assumptions, right? So that you can say, well, that is just more proof of emptiness, right? Because we're using a certain conceptual apparatus. and therefore it's relative, and therefore it's empty.
Are you saying then that if we were trying to show emptiness to people with completely different presuppositions, we would have to use entirely different arguments from these ones? But
Absolutely.
that very fact that we have to use all sorts of different arguments to show emptiness, given different presuppositions of the audience, itself constitutes evidence towards our position?
I would say it does.
I would agree with that.
I would say it does, but I guess the larger point that I'm trying to make is that this is like really meta if you start to think about it, and certain Rinpoches, who talk about this are very eloquent in the way they discuss it, but better than I ever could. But essentially the whole method is empty thing, if you start to apply that to the scriptures itself, you could see from one point of view, you could say, oh, well, if this particular method doesn't work for me, well, methods are just skillful means anyway, and some of the other ones will work. But I don't think that that's the way you should think about it. I think the way you should think about it is, if you can find holes in an argument, but nothing else makes sense either, then that's the goal, Yeah. I don't know where I was going with that. But yeah.
Sorry. So so people are starting to leave because we're already at the second hour. I just wanted to read the last sentence of this chapter on the commentary, just to conclude. There is no plausible account of the origination of a real effect, and in the absence of a real effect, nothing can be said to be either a condition or a non-condition. So I guess that's the conclusion you have to get. And if you haven't gotten that, keep reading that chapter. No, just joking. We'll keep going forward. Yeah, so does anyone want to make any last comments, quick comments about that before we end for today?
I just wanted to say one thing, which is if you haven't come to that conclusion, and there's still like a level of confidence in kind of causal structures of creating things that do hold or creating things that do have intrinsic, nature, if you're still fighting against this, then I think one thing that's interesting is if you're focused on like causal, conditions bringing about certain effects, then, and you're trying to use a method, and if you believe in the non-emptiness of things, what's going to happen is what happens is we get out of the present moment and we think in terms of causality, like, well, if this A, B, C, D, and E is going to lead to this point, down the road, I'm going to use these 6 methods to get to there. This is something I guess everybody's already heard a million times, but just another iteration of it. Just that if we're thinking in terms of causal structures and that they're going to bring about things that do hold, then we're going to, like, our consciousness is getting out of the moment, ahead of ourselves, to bring about these, to bring about certain effects, which ultimately is diluting the present moment of its richness. Thought I was going to say something different than everybody's already heard a million times, but then I went and said that.
That's really great though, because I think that what Kazi was saying earlier about like the practical applications is like really important. Just that if you think about how it can be practically applied, I think that that's better in certain ways of like, well, what's the benefit of thinking that there is no, cause and effect, right? Well, maybe you won't, focus too much on like things, hypotheticals in the future that may or may not happen. And maybe you're certain that this is the way things are, and then you'll get really disappointed when they're not that way. Like that's I think is a really great point. is that
Yeah, if you have no confidence in the ability for causal structures to bring about, permanence or something like that, then your only other option is just to pay attention to what's happening right now.
Yeah, and I think part of this is also that like you can have a causal account of something, but you don't have so much investment in them, in a sense, in a kind of complete certainty. You know that not only do you know that there are contingencies that you can't account for, but even your account of the causal structure that you're occupied with is based on your perspective in that moment and your interests. So they don't exist objectively out there. So they're conditioned by your interests too. And I think being reflexively aware of that will actually help us have better causal accounts. That, because, when we turn on the faucet, water comes down. So there's an extent to which like causality exists in a useful, pragmatic, conventional way. And perhaps the point is to be cognizant and aware of the fact that these causal pictures, causal narratives are, conventionally designated, mentally illustrated, and that can be avenues or lens through which we interact with the world, but they won't actually bring us what we want by themselves.
And that as we employ them, our own frame of reference shifts. What you made me think
totally.
here is that we're going to have a better chance at giving better causal accounts, because now, since our own frame of reference is shifting around, we have to still give a causal account, but we can't give the same one as we gave last time. And right, because but we still have to give a causal account in order to operate with the world. But now it's somewhat, the substrate is shifted, and so to get the same effect, a new causal structure is going to need to be had there. And if you were too attached to this like absolutist kind of, these conditions create this effect, you might try to employ that exact same path as last time, right? But I like what you're saying about how this middle path, where you're still going to have to deal with causal structures. It's still going to be that was helpful for me.
Yeah, and and I think that's a really good point about how your perspective will change as you're undergoing that task too. Sort of makes me think a little bit about second order cybernetics, and how understanding that the observer is actually a constituent part of the system and has effects on the system. So it's a much better way of dealing with systems, because you're accounting for more in there. Whereas if you're just sort of this neutral observer of a system, you're not seeing how you're affecting it in the process,
or how it's affecting your lens through which you're affecting it.
Yeah, exactly.
Part of the system is feeding it.
Cool. So anyone have any last comments before we head out for the day? Just short comments.
Just wanted to say thank you. Very, very eloquent ways you guys are explaining all of this. I'm glad to see that there's like a way to take these kind of very abstract arguments. You can bring them with a little bit of effort down to earth. That's good.
Yeah, thanks you all for joining. Oh, Mark, do you have a point?
Oh no, just wanted to say thank you. That was really, really nice. So thank you.
Great. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining. Gregor, do you have something to say?
Just as a curiosity, I'm also reading Slovene translation of this book.
Oh, great! Awesome. Who's the author of that by any chance? Do you know?
Well, it was translated by Anna Bajel, Sebastian Veres, and Gasper Kvartic, and commentaries and introduction was written by Sebastian Veres and Anna Bajel. This Sebastian Veres is a professor at Department for Philosophy here in Ljubljana. He was my colleague when I was at the postgraduate study, which I didn't finish.
Cool.
Sorry?
Oh, so that's cool that you know the person.
Yeah, I didn't see him for quite some years now, but I guess he would remember me.
Oh, nice to know that it's translated in Slovenian. That's cool.
Anyway, yeah, this was published a few years ago. Maybe it would be interesting. In the commentary, they mentioned that understanding of this differences between or sameness of causes and conditions, how we understand this also is this implies also how we understand Nāgārjuna. I mean, for example, they say that this Garfield. I mean, they say it's not just subtle hair splitting like in scholasticism, but for example, this Garfield sees continuity between abhidharmic conception of conditions and some other interpreters see there is a radical break between Nāgārjuna's conception and Abhidharma's, and so on and so on. I mean, basically, I just wanted to show the book. So.
Cool. That's a really interesting. That's a really cool point about, you know, is Nāgārjuna destroying Abhidharma, or is he sort of reconstructing it on Mahayana terms? You know, that's a really interesting concern to have. And I personally definitely think that a lot of what he's refuting, you know, when he brings up, you know, notions that are important to Abhidharma scholasticism, he's not saying that we should eliminate with those notions or get rid of them completely, but that in order to properly make sense of them, we have to shift from intrinsic nature to dependently originated phenomena. You know, from intrinsic existence to dependent existence, I guess you can say. So in a way, it's like a rehabilitation of a lot of these concepts. You know, there's a chapter where he deals with the 12 links of dependent origination. It'd be really weird to say that he breaks with that, you know, as a Buddhist. I think he's more so clarifying how to make proper sense of it through a Madhyamaka, from an emptiness perspective. But yeah, so this was very helpful to try to understand how to even lead these things. Clearly, we need a lot more time than just an hour, which makes a lot of sense. This is really dense stuff, and some of the other chapters will also be a little bit difficult. Some of them will be a little easier. So I guess
we could go a bit slow, or like not go a bit slower, but we could like read the whole chapter for next time, but split our discussion of it into 2 pieces.
Sure. The only thing I'm just concerned about is like you know, having this run for months and, you know, potentially losing people or just losing continuity. I guess we can go. I think the next thing I'll try for next week is to read the verses in blocks instead of going one by one. I think that will help us go quicker. And there's no need to go through every single verse, honestly, either. I think it's been really helpful talking about, you know, all of our different concerns in a more general sense to help clarify the whole chapter. So I'll do more of that next time. So I guess for next week, we'll read the 2nd chapter an analysis of the traversed, the not yet traversed, and the presently being traversed. I think the other translations is about the moved, the not yet moved, and the being moved kind of thing. And that's an interesting chapter about motion. So yeah, so same time, 1 p.m. we'll be here. And thank you everyone for participating. And I'm going to post a recording of this on the group. And if we have any more discussion questions or anything else we want to add, we can do that on that post.
Just a technical question.
Yes.
I was wondering, is it appropriate to post the video, for example, of last week on Facebook, so that somebody who is not a member of our group could also see it maybe? And
oh yeah, if you want to share the links, totally go ahead. On your page or other pages, you're free to do that, definitely. And if you know people who are interested and who potentially want to join the group, we're open to having anyone join in at any time. And if you have to miss a meeting or two, that's totally fine as well. That's why I'm recording these, so that towards the end, hopefully we would have the entire Mulamajamuka Karika discussions recorded. So all of us and also people who haven't been able to participate can look over that for reference. So yeah, share freely.
thank you.
No, thank you. All right. Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Kazi.